It's not been an easy few months for the mayor of Canada's largest city. There's a court case, public blunders, many angry voters, but some supportive ones too. As Toronto Mayor Rob Ford enters his third year at the helm, we're checking in with the state of Ford Nation. And to help us to do just that, we're joined in studio by Karen Stintz, Toronto City Councillor for Ward 16, Eglinton Lawrence, and Toronto Transit Commission Chair. John Matheson, Principal at Strategy Corps. Ivor Tossell, freelance journalist and the author of the forthcoming ebook, The Gift of Ford, and John Lawrence, Toronto journalist who covers urban affairs for Spacing and the Globe and Mail. As well, producers Danielle Kitts and Naveen Vaswani are hosting a Twitter chat on this topic right now, so send in your thoughts using the hashtag AgendaTVO. Hello to you all around the table. Welcome back to the program. I want to start by reading something that was written in the Globe and Mail last week by Marcus G. Take a listen to this. Mayor Rob Ford loves coaching, and his football program helps troubled youth. Why can't he miss a few meetings to keep it going? Why shouldn't he enlist his staff to help? Before letting the mayor off the hook for slipping away from City Hall to coach and taking city staffers along with him, remember this. Rob Ford built his political career on scrutinizing the use of taxpayers' money. Again and again in his 10-year run as a city councillor, he roasted other councillors for playing fast and loose with their office budgets and staff. He even went after them for serving sandwiches at evening council meetings. If he himself has been using publicly paid staff for a private pursuit, however laudable, then he has some explaining to do. The Code of Conduct for City Council says that, quote, no member of council should use or permit the use of city land, facilities, equipment, supplies, services, staff, or other resources for activities other than the business of the corporation, that is, the City of Toronto. Okay, Karen Stintz, that's what Marcus G has to say. I am wondering what you think. Is it hypocritical for Mayor Ford to employ his office staff, who also volunteer for his football team, given that he ran on a platform of stopping the misappropriation of funds at City Hall, specifically stopping the gravy train?
Yeah, well, I think that Mayor Ford's defense would be that his staff work long hours and the time that they spend assisting him coaching football is off hours or their volunteer time. And I think that there could be some merit to that if it wasn't in the middle of the day or there was more, or if the mayor didn't miss an executive committee to go and coach football. So I think that probably there is some truth to the mayor's defense, but I think there also is some optics that the mayor may choose to pay more attention to in the future.
Okay, Karen puts up, John, the argument that the mayor has made, that these guys work a long time and they're allowed to do this and they're not misusing anything. Is it hypocritical for the guy who said, I'm coming into office, elect me to stop the gravy train, to now be accused of doing these things?
Well, you know, the mayor puts himself on a high pedestal when he talks about wanting to reform the public service the way he is. And so whether it's hypocritical or not, the real problem is managing to achieve his agenda requires him to be above reproach. I mean, he's asking a lot of people to make a lot of sacrifices. And from a point of view of political effectiveness, you could argue that it's a risk that he didn't need to take. I mean, Marcus G is a pretty clever guy, and people can read the Code of Conduct on their own and make their own judgments about what the mayor's doing. I think where a lot of people would be concerned on the Ford Nation side of things are, he was elected to do a job, to change and reform things. And for somebody who is a football coach, this feels a lot like an offside penalty or an unnecessary roughness. And, you know, it's self-defeating behavior.
Ivor, it's, football puns, football analogies, all that. We're talking a lot about football, but at the end of the day, for you, is the hypocrisy the bigger issue, or is it that he's allegedly broken the rules?
There's a perception of a double standard at play right here, and I think that that's getting under people's skin, especially where it comes to the smaller incidents, the driving while reading, things like that. Ford has been on about these council expenses for a decade, for more than 12 years, and these are small ticket items in the greater scheme of things, but they really resonated with voters in the general election, and I think this really powered an awful lot of what we perceived as, rightly or wrongly, Ford Nation. So no, I think that really kind of underlies a lot of what we're seeing in the last couple of weeks, and this is the first thing, or one of the first things that could really undermine his base of support.
Okay, John Lawrence, what really bugs people about all this with Mayor Ford?
Well, I think that he practices the politics of self-righteousness, and he came into office on the politics of self-righteousness, and so he hasn't, he doesn't seem to be living up to that standard that he's set for himself. And with a guy like Mayor Ford, who is so adamant about not using public funds for just about everything, including policy development, it seems really kind of odd that he's, he's ducking out of council meetings to to pursue this private interest, however laudable. And I think that a lot of Torontonians would give him, cut him a bit of slack, for, a football practice every now and again. But it seems to dominate his attention to to a far greater degree than is appropriate. And I think that that's the point where we're at, that, it's sort of gone over the line.
I think there is a consistent theme, though, in the last 12 years that has continued on in his mayoral tenure, and that Rob Ford he never plays by the rules. He didn't when he was a councillor, and he continues to live by his own set of rules as he's the mayor. And I think that there is a large part of the population that thinks that that's okay, because they don't understand the rules that we play by. They don't seem to make sense to people. And so here we have a mayor who wants to go out and coach football, and well, that's a good thing to do. And they don't understand an executive committee, and quite frankly, they don't care.
And there is a certain appeal to a mayor who doesn't play by the
rules,
right?
Absolutely. But I think you make a very good point in that they did send him to office to do some things. And I think that although he's consistently breaking his rules, or breaking the rules, is he getting enough done? And is his agenda clear? And there's a question, does he actually even like being the mayor? Because when you look at how he spends his time, it's with the kids, it's with the football, we're not sure because we don't know where he spends his time in a day, and we have to do FOIs to find out his schedule. So I think it's not the question of whether he's a hypocrite or spending taxpayer money inappropriately. I think it's a question of how long can he continue to not play by the rules, and is he continuing to be effective as the mayor?
You posed a great question. I want to ask everyone about this. Do you think he likes being mayor?
I think he likes elements of the job, no question, and I think he has been successful in many aspects of his mayoral tenure. But there's a lot getting done, and some of it's getting done in spite of him. And I think that is one of the other issues that has us all take pause, because when you look at the things that are getting done, you don't even know where the mayor might stand on those issues, and yet they're important issues around affordable housing, transit, taxes, infrastructure renewal. And I don't think anybody clearly knows where the mayor stands on those issues.
John Matheson, for years, you've worked with politicians. You know all too well that sometimes the guy that thinks the job is going to be amazing gets into it and thinks, it's not all that it's cracked up to be. Does this mayor like his job?
Well, I think he likes parts of it. The attributes.
What parts?
Well, the attributes of a great politician are sort of one part the ability to communicate a real authenticity of something that you really passionately believe in. And when Rob Ford is at its best is when he's doing the gee shucks, I'm just out there helping the kids, or the kind of gee shucks, the taxpayer needs a break. But then there's a kind of discipline that you have to back that up with. It's been called the discipline of power by some authors, where you need to be able to actually suppress that drama and bring it into just the grinding discipline of getting things done. And I think it's apparent that the discipline side of the equation is a little bit weak. But if he could ever get back to what it is that was authentic about him, that made people elect him in the first place, that would be his happy place. But he's not there right now.
Robert, what about you? Do you think that the mayor in his most private moments talking to himself might think to himself, gee, I wish I would have never gone for this thing. Wish I never became the mayor of the city of Toronto?
Ford really seemed to enjoy being a ward councillor, and he was very popular as a ward councillor, elected over and over again. He really seems to enjoy, as we've said, knocking on doors, being out there, returning calls. He was all about returning calls, returning every single call. He likes talking to people. And it seems from the outside in that he really wanted to take that operation, out in his own ward and scale it up. And he wanted to be a mayor who would just kind of troubleshoot small neighborhood items, the housing problems, the speed bumps. But he would do that for the entire city. He'd just be the troubleshooter in chief. He's had his staff kind of doing similar tasks. It didn't really work out that way because the skill set and the way you need to spend your time as a mayor is not the same thing that you do as a councillor.
All right, John Lawrence, do you agree? Does the mayor like his job, or does they say he kind of likes parts of it, maybe not some others? What do you think?
I don't think that he's got his head in the space that a political leader needs to be thinking. I think that he clearly, to me, does not understand the political power that he has, and he's not able to exercise it in an effective way. And so, I agree with Ivor. I think he's basically trying to be a ward councillor to the entire city. There are mayors that have done that kind of thing well. Daley in Chicago, Cory Booker in New Jersey. They're both very, they were attentive to like little constituent problems, but I think that not to the exclusion of everything else. And I think that he sort of keeps his focus down. And to me, it does raise the question of whether he likes the job. I think he's also shy. Mel was shy too. Mel Lastman was shy too. And maybe he's not that comfortable with the big stage and the big, the big pronouncements.
John, you mentioned that maybe the mayor doesn't, I don't know how else to put it, but doesn't get the job in its entirety. And John Matheson, I want to ask you because again, you have worked with politicians for many, many years, and the fact that he seems to either be getting bad advice or he seems to be getting good advice that he's not following. Which one do you think it is? Because he has people around him that should be advising him.
I think it's pretty safe to say that most strong politicians like Rob Ford are their own best and worst advisor. They are at their best when they are kind of in that zone. And sometimes that can be like lightning in a bottle. Sometimes it's something that you capture in one particular campaign when you define yourself in opposition to something. Sustaining it through the discipline of power is very difficult. And when you go from being a counselor, an opposition politician, trusting to your own day-to-day instincts, moving into the discipline of administration and understanding how to work with senior public servants and understanding how to work with political staff, understanding that they're not just something whose budgets that you trim, but they're actually something that they're a group of people who dedicate themselves to figuring out how to bridge the gap between politicians and public servants and other councillors and put together a durable coalition that can achieve a platform. I mean, that is something that making that transition is very difficult. And if you look at one way of telling the story of political history in this country is looking at people who couldn't make that transition from fighter against something to builder who was able to sustain something. And that, so is he taking his own advice? Yes. Is he taking the advice of those around him? I'm not so sure.
I think that we have to add that he takes his brother's advice way too much. I think that if his brother was not in the picture, this whole term would have played out somewhat differently. But the brother has a great need for attention, and on a number of occasions has derailed the mayor's agenda. And it's an interesting phenomenon. And I think that the mayor's staff must be thwarted by the fact that who's he listening to?
Yeah. Well, I have a slightly different take on it, in that I think that the mayor doesn't. To your point, good retail politician, not many people can have a barbecue in their backyard for 7,000 people, right? Like, the reality is, so he's got a great way to connect with people, but he doesn't have a good way to articulate his agenda. Beyond little guy taxpayers, saving the taxpayer dollars, and beyond that, we don't know what his agenda is. And I think Doug Ford, in his effort to help, tries to articulate an agenda, but maybe not thinking it through fully. And suddenly, Councillor Ford's agenda gets confused as Mayor Ford's agenda. And because Mayor Ford is not articulating what he wants to achieve, it gets quite confusing for people. And the press picks up with it, and councillors are like, I didn't know that's what we were doing. And so it becomes very noisy. So City Hall is a very noisy place. And and I think what we will see happen over time is if this noise continues, people will just tune it out. And they won't care. And the mayor will continue to break the rules, will continue to get away with it, he'll continue to have the piling on, it will continue to be noisy, nobody will know what is going on. Everybody thinks City Hall is dysfunctional anyway, so that'll just be that. And the next election will come, and who knows what the ballot question will be.
There's been such a psychodrama around the Fords, and especially the fact that they are a brother act. It kind of makes it all the more dramatic in a way. And that's led to a surge of interest in City Hall over the last couple of years, but I think you raise a really good point, which is that it could peak and just go right downhill, and we could be worse off than when we started.
And I guess the question is, Ivor, though, is there a renewed interest in actual City Hall policy and politics, or just perhaps the sideshow and the distraction?
Great question, and I feel like a year ago we were having a real discussion about the future of the city and what the priorities of the city were going to be, whether we were going to be a city that spends on services or a city that pares back, or so on and so forth, because this was the agenda items were front and center. Now it's just psychodrama. Now it's just sideshow and distraction and personal foibles, and I don't think anyone's really enjoying it, critics or supporters alike.
John Lawrence, where did this fall off the rails? If a year ago we were talking, we did the show a year ago, you were here talking to Steve about the first year of the mayor's term and talking about things about privatization of garbage and other policy issues. Haven't heard much about that in the news with the mayor lately. Where did this fall off the rails in the last year?
Well, I mean, there was a very precise moment when it fell off the rails, and that's when the mayor's brother decided to railroad through a waterfront redevelopment scheme that was, wildly. It was totally out of left field. He kind of got an agenda. He got his plan onto the agenda, and it precipitated the first really significant loss for Mayor Ford, and it led to this, the famous kumbaya moment when council voted unanimously in favor of a process. But since that point, and that point clearly marks the end of Act 1 and the beginning of Act 2, since that moment, the mayor has had a great deal of trouble consistently advancing the agenda that he was elected on: the subways, the budget cuts, the housing, which he didn't run on, but he made a big deal out of at the beginning of the term, and that's the moment. And so it's from then on, we have a much more diffuse decision-making process.
I mean, we can't have a conversation about Mayor Ford's last year without talking about the conflict of interest trial. We're still waiting for the judge's decision. Where does that fit into all of this? Because as I see it, I mean, that is about a substantial issue. I mean, the guy could lose his job over that. The other stuff, and I'm not saying they're inconsequential, but some of it's perception, some of it's whether you like Mayor Ford or you don't, and it's polarizing perception perhaps more than this. How important is this conflict of interest trial to the mayorship, to how the city is run?
Well, as you say, it's a make it or break it proposition, because we could be in a whole new process of replacing the mayor if this goes the wrong way. I think it cuts to the core of a couple of issues. His testimony when there was the hearing 2 weeks ago, in which his only real defense for having breached conflict of interest rules was, I don't understand conflict of interest rules. I didn't read the handbook. I didn't do my homework. He was forced to read, like a schoolboy, the mayoral handbook that he did not read before swearing his oath. And so his defense was incompetence.
Just for folks who don't live in Toronto, might not know this intimately, just remind us briefly what the conflict of interest pertains to.
So Rob Ford has a football foundation that helps equip high school football teams. And of course, he's a coach, and this is very important to him. He, in the course of doing his business as a councillor, this is before he was elected mayor, would routinely solicit donations for this foundation. And he would solicit donations of many people, including people he was doing business with at the city, including lobbyists. And so the Integrity Commissioner ruled that he should have to pay some of this money back. Now, fast forward to when he is mayor in February of this year, this issue was brought to council because it was felt that he should not have to pay this money back. He was just helping kids, after all. And so, of course, when one has a financial interest in something that is before a council, the rules say you should recuse yourself and not vote. But what the mayor did, in fact, was he spoke up on this debate in his own defense and explained why he should not have to pay this money back. And indeed, when it came to a vote, he voted for not having to pay the money back.
John Lawrence, you were in the courtroom when lawyer Clayton Ruby, who's a pretty tough nut as lawyer to go up against, is questioning the mayor, cross-examining him. What are your impressions of how the mayor did, how he held up?
I found it a very strange experience because, as a reporter, I mean, the mayor doesn't answer questions of the media. He takes 3 questions and then he moves on. So the mayor was on the stand for much of the day. I thought that, it was very odd and somewhat disillusioning to hear him admit that he hasn't read all of these things that kind of, sort of set out the framework for, how the councillors have to operate. And he seemed to me to be kind of a lonely guy out of his depth. And, he's stuck in this situation that I don't think he really understood that he was going to get into. And it's a very serious situation. So, he's got a great lawyer, and the lawyer is going to defend him to the nines. But
Doing his job.
Doing his job, yeah.
Karen, let me ask you, did you watch the proceedings?
No, I really didn't. I think, again, it was, and not to dismiss the seriousness of conflict of interest, because I actually think that the principle of conflict of interest, particularly in municipal politics, is something that needs to be upheld. Because we vote on land deals, rezoning, we vote on a lot of issues that if we stand to gain as a councillor, it's very damaging to the reputation of the city and individuals. So I think that we do need to protect the whole conflict of interest and take it quite seriously. I think that in this case, you can argue that whether he should lose his job or not, I don't know, but whether we need to strengthen our policies, perhaps. But again, it's another distraction and a sideshow. And when we have businesses that are having trouble getting established, when we have an economy that needs all the support it can from City Hall, when we have housing issues and all the things, transportation, gridlock, Board of Trade, like we have so many issues that it just, to have that issue suck away all the airtime, I think is just a distraction that we don't need right now.
Well, give me a sense of that, because the councillors talk not only in the council chambers, but they're working together all the time. And whether you're, conservative, liberal, whatever. I mean, what's the mayor? I shouldn't say the mayor. The stories about the mayor seem to take up a lot of the time, suck up a lot of the oxygen coming out of City Hall. What's the impact been on council?
Well, I think, let me answer it a different way. I think that because of the circus feel and environment, there is also this theme that the mayor really doesn't understand how City Hall works. And so although he can get some things done because he can call and have a pothole filled, the more complicated aspects of City Hall, like actually how we cut through red tape, are beyond what the mayors can comprehend and actually accomplish. And so how do we actually improve service? How do we streamline our business? How do we get new business into the city? How do we create wealth that we all say that notionally we, as a shared goal, we want? How do we build the waterfront? How do we invest in transit? And these are more complicated than how you get a pothole filled. And as this circus is unfolding, it I think does beg the question, does the mayor understand enough about how City Hall functions to actually get the job done?
Okay, but let me ask you this, Karen, because a few months ago, you were in the news all the time over transit as the chair. You're not in the news as much.
I'm not there anymore.
Okay, but let me ask you this. I mean, isn't part of it your and other councillors' responsibility to get this city agenda, the things that you say are so important, back on track, rather than saying, you know what, there's this distraction and kind of play into the media interest over the distraction, the public interest into it?
No question, and that's why we brought forward One City, because we felt that it was important to have a vision for transit and a way to fund it. But without the mayor's support or without the legitimacy of that position, it was a difficult proposition to bring to council. And so to your point, John, the mayor has a lot of power, and understanding how to use that power to advance a city agenda is critical.
You understand voters quite well. It's been your job to understand voters. We've talked about this. The mayor's message has consistently been, these things are very laudable. I'm helping the kids, that these kids wouldn't have a chance if I didn't do these football things. And so whatever I do, it's okay, because it's a good deed. Do you think that message, where are voters sitting on this? Does everyone buy into, does his base still buy that message?
Well, firstly, right now, the fire is raging. And so it is premature to say whether this is going to hurt him or not, because you never know if the bulkheads are going to hold, if you will. But what I would say is this. There are some people who think better of him than ever, because they think, that's my guy. The little people are out there trying to stop him. They're the ones who I put him in place to give the elites. I put him in there to give them a good swift kick in the behind. The only reason he's got these problems is because he's annoyed them. And who could be offended by some spending on football? This is ridiculous. You go get him, you're my guy. And there are people who still think that. There are others who think, actually, I elected you to run the city and to achieve a lot of the things that Karen is talking about. And there's some things that you did very well indeed in terms of getting the budget passed and turning the corner on that, not managing to solve the labor discussions without a strike. But Guy, I'm not seeing a lot of progress since. And we put you there to fix this place, not to give the joint character, And unfortunately, there's a little bit too much distraction. And so, in every politician's career, there's a moment when they lose touch. And no one knows, in part because right now, that there's no, well, him or who else. In part because there's no other choice. There's no burning platform to actually say, why would I change? But, I think that a wise man once said, if you have to walk through a minefield, take your snowshoes off first. And it feels as though the mayor is wearing the largest pair of snowshoes he could possibly wear as he walks through a political minefield, because there's so many risks that could have been managed down, which instead he's escalated up on. And whether his coalition will hold, I think will have a lot to do with whether he can give people the confidence that he has still got some important policy choices left to make, which make him a sideshow worth turning into the main feature again of public policy. Because he really runs the risk right now of taking himself out of his own picture.
John, let's pick up on that. Is the mayor, is it going to be a sideshow, or is he going to be able to galvanize his troops again?
Well, he hasn't been able to galvanize his troops for a year. I mean, he gets people who like to listen to his radio show on Sundays, but he doesn't have any command over council. He hasn't had it for a year. And at the end of the day, there are 45 people who make the decisions that determine what this municipality is going to do, and they'll do it for another 2 years. And he's not got those votes for the most part. So, and that's because he doesn't build consensus. He likes a kind of, he likes the scrappy kind of politics. And the scrappy politics is what got him into office, but it's not going to keep him in office because he can't get his program through.
Ivor, 45 people, they all get one vote. How come we're spending you're a journalist, how come we're spending so much time talking about this mayor, not about things that Karen and others argue, we should be talking about down at City Hall?
Because the mayoralty is important, and I think that that's one of the great lessons that's coming out of this period. Yes, he's just one vote, but he's directly elected by a votership of 2.5 million or slightly less. That gives him a huge mandate, and it's his job to lead. He doesn't have that power, in a direct sense, but he has the power in a moral sense, and you need that. I think you made a great point, John, about he wasn't elected to bring character, but the voters of Toronto do have a habit of voting characters in. We're good that way. And I think what we've learned out of this is that you need a mayor. And by voting for Ford in the first place, his record was on display. We had YouTube in 2010. We knew what we were voting for. And I think that there was a certain sense of, well, it's just a mayor. It's just a municipal government. Municipal government doesn't get the same respect that provincial government does, that federal government does. But it really, really matters, because if you don't have someone who's going to take the lead, who knows how to take a political leadership position on these issues, stuff doesn't happen.
Let's turn it around a little bit. Let's talk about the positive things that have happened in the last year. Karen, you're the politician. What's the accomplishment you're most proud of that's happened at City Hall over the last year?
Me personally?
Yeah.
I think getting the transit plan back on track. I think the areas that will be served by transit right now are the most underserved areas of the city. And I think transit is one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure we can bring to those neighborhoods.
John, what stands out for you?
Well, you asked before, is he taking his own advice or listening to those around him? And the moments when he did manage to work with large numbers of council members and achieve things like the Solid United Front that got him the labor negotiation settled without a strike, terms very favorable to the taxpayer side of the agenda. That is precisely what the people who voted for him put him there to do. Now, I do think it's interesting that what Karen would say is her favorite moment of transit success would not be the mayor's favorite moment of transit success, which underscores my second point, which is, he's at his best when he's a big tent and when he's working with people. Doesn't go so well for the mayor when he doesn't manage to achieve that. But like the work that Councillor Mendenhall has been doing on privatizing the garbage, and the work that many of the members of the executive committee, Karen included, have been doing a terrific job on lots of things, driving the general direction that the mayor's team wanted to drive. There have been successes, but it's some of the side effects to the successes that I think people would like to see mitigated.
Ivor, when you were here last year, you said, the thing that you thought that the mayor had learned the most is that change is harder than you think it's going to be. So in the past year, over the past 12 months or so, what has been the accomplishment that stands out for you coming out of City Hall?
Well, there's been moments where the mayor has really stepped up to the plate. He stepped up to the plate after the Eaton Centre shooting, and I think people were really pleased to see that. But some of the side effects have been positive as well. And I think to what Karen was saying earlier, we are now talking about how to pay for transit. This is not perhaps the mayor's direct accomplishment, because he would not talk about how to pay for transit. But we're now actually having this conversation of, we need transit in this city. Are the taxpayers willing to pay for it? Because that's the only way it's going to happen. And I think that's on the agenda now.
That's a great point.
What stands out for you, John, over the last year? In a good way?
Well, I think that the interesting thing about the way council has functioned is that it shows, that maybe we need mayors less than we thought we did. And I go back a few years when David Miller was the mayor, and there was a lot of pressure to create a strong mayor system and to increase the powers of the mayor. And the province did a little bit, and council did a little bit, but not too much, because our political culture prefers sort of more collective decision making. And I think that what I've found interesting over the last year is that the men and women who sit around that table sort of looked at the situation. They looked at the direction that things were going. The possibility of wasting huge amounts of money on a terrible transit plan, and kind of took the agenda back and have operated without like one person in charge. And I think that's kind of interesting to me. It's and it sort of goes against our idea of what how governments function, because we think there's Stephen Harper, he's like the guy in charge, and if things happen only if he wants them to happen. But here it's sort of worked out differently, and to me that's the most interesting thing.
Let me ask you this, because repeatedly the mayor takes issue with journalists like yourself, like myself. He has a few, I guess, friends in the media. Some of them aren't as kind to him as perhaps they once were. And there are his backers who say, John, the likes of you, the likes of Ivor, you're just picking on this mayor, that he's being unfairly scrutinized. Agree?
Well, I mean, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. He's a political leader. He has to be scrutinized. And
but is he being held to a different account by journalists?
No, I think that he creates a lot of the problems. He is his own worst enemy, and he has stepped in it so often in ways where he could have easily avoided the problems. The whole conflict of interest charge is a classic example. He had the votes to carry to set aside that fine. He didn't need to stand up and talk to it, and we wouldn't be talking about whether he's going to be mayor 2 months from now.
Ivor, is this a pile-on by us journalists?
I don't think journalists actually enjoy a pile-on as much as it might seem from the outside in.
Fair point.
I think it's probably fair to say that many were not predisposed to like him coming in. But at the same time, I think people are now really eager to find something positive to talk about in this situation, because nobody likes to be put in a position of having to pile on, and yet the news keeps coming.
Karen, what do you think? Because the journalists are going to defend themselves and their craft, so they're a little bit biased.
I think if we start talking again about the city issues, about how we're going to pay for transit, about how we're going to streamline our processes at City Hall, if we start having those discussions, then there will be less of a pile-on effect on the mayor's behaviors. But absent those discussions, and then when again, the weigh-in, when you pull an industrial-sized scale and you park it outside of City Hall and you pledge to the universe that you're going to lose weight, to your point, you need to be disciplined enough to lose the weight. And there's not, nobody asked him to do that. He did it himself. That was his own initiative. And so to suggest that the media was somehow piling on him because he didn't meet his targets, I think is actually unfair, because that was something that he himself set up.
In that specific case, when he ended it, he complained that it was
Right.
It had become a media event.
Right.
Well, it was a media event by design.
Well, it was designed to be a media event, and again, that's the only time he ever spoke to reporters or showed up for any media. So all the other issues of the day became discussion points when he was stepping on the scale. So it all cascaded, and to your point, it didn't need to. It could have been a great news story. The entire city was behind him.
If he'd done 6 of the
Right.
Chicago business trips, the Chicago business trip is
Right.
great,
Yeah.
right? That's what he should be
Where he
doing.
is right now.
Yeah,
Where he is right now.
it's mayoral. He's got a whole bunch of people from Bay Street with him. It's great. If he'd done that 6 times instead of stepping into it 6 times and causing these unnecessary problems for him, we would be having a completely different discussion.
Okay, let me ask you this. What if he stepped in it, as you say, 6 times, but also went to Chicago or did something equivalent 6 times? Would we still be talking about the stepping in it?
Well, no, I think it speaks to the issue of discipline. I mean, John has advised ministers, cabinet ministers, and you need a certain discipline. You are given huge amounts of power over large organizations, and you have to have a disciplined approach. It's like, to use the football analogy, you call the play, you play the play, right? Instead of getting sidetracked by lots of melodrama.
John Matheson, let's ask for some political advice, free advice for the mayors in Chicago. Maybe he'll watch us online, I don't know. But what would you tell him now? Advise him.
Well, I would firstly, if you think about what people put him in there to do, it was to restore a sense of, if you will, common sense to the city that people thought had lost that kind of common sense. And what that means, I think, is doing everything that he's succeeded in doing on the financial side of the agenda. But it means having the discipline to spread that out to many of the other activities. I mean, the transit agenda was a terrible example, I think, of where there was an inadequate attention to discipline. The fact that broke down, the way in which it broke down, that's the kind of thing that cannot be repeated. But it's the requirement of stopping the manageable mistakes. I mean, I will pick up the cudgel. I think that when he was first elected, there was a whole lot of people who hated him so much ex ante, like right from the beginning, that they were looking for him to make a mistake, and they were going to enjoy his mistakes with that kind of unique, yeah, exactly, that unique sort of desire to see him fail. So I think it started that way. The problem is when you're in that situation, you're not supposed to give them so many things to pile on about, right? And so it's not so much that they've been unfair, is that they may have been too well fed with, by him with his mistakes. And so, he's got to remember what put him there in the first place, but he's got to remember it's a team sport. And the thing that reforming Conservatives often need to remember is that you cannot run a government without dealing with the public servants. And just because you're trying to put the public service on a diet does not mean you can afford to be at war with your public service. And when the morale of the public service plummets, that's part your fault. And you've got to be able, if you expect to bring about change in the public sector, you've got to mobilize the public sector. And it's the hardest thing. But being able to kind of cut down on the unnecessary insult that they can take while you're bringing about reform is actually really important, because if you want the public to see positive change, you have to mobilize the workforce to do positive change. So you stick to your values, you minimize the mistakes, you mobilize the team, you make sure that your supporters are your supporters. That's the basics.
What does he have to do, Ivor? What do you want to see this mayor do to get, I don't know if we put it this way, but to put his mayorship back on track?
There's an awful lot of flexibility in the mayor's job. You can be many different kinds of mayor because the job is so loosely defined. He could be a figurehead mayor. He could keep himself to being a booster of Toronto, to doing the Chicago type trips, to being an ambassador, to being an opener, and leave the heavy lifting to council. He could do that if he wanted to. I think, as we say, we need to minimize the collateral damage that's caused, minimize the amount of declaring war on people that seems to kind of compulsively happen. He's a likable guy, and to be honest, Toronto is a kind of a fundamentally fiscally conservative place. It's not a hard sell in Toronto to say let's rein in the budget. And I think there's a lot of support for that on council. But if he just minimized, as I say, the collateral damage that happens voluntarily, I also think he needs to get out of his bubble. I think he listens a lot to the people who call him, the people who talk to him, and I don't know if he's willing to let other voices in.
We've got about a minute left. John Lawrence, I want to ask you, we're 2 years away from an election. If nothing happens out of this conflict of interest trial, if the mayor ran again tomorrow, if we had an election tomorrow, would he win?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer in the absence of a challenger, and I don't want to duck your question, but I think that one of the reasons that he did win is because so many voters were really dissatisfied with George Smitherman. So there were a lot of Reagan Democrats in Ford Nation, and so if there was a compelling challenger, do those people sort of cleave off and go back? It's hard to say, but I think that what a lot of voters see is a kind of an Alamo sort of scenario in the mayor's office, and that's not a good story to sell, really.
Karen, I want to ask you, because we're having a live Twitter chat right now, and some people are asking, 2014, is Karen Stintz going to run for mayor of the city?
We have a mayor. And to your original question, I actually think if he ran tomorrow, he would get reelected, because I think he could point to a number of successes and legitimately point to a number of successes. I think his challenge actually is the next 2 years, and being able to continue to achieve successes over the next 2 years.
Good way to evade the question. Thank you all for coming in tonight. Thank you very much. Toronto City Councillor Karen Stintz, Strategy Corps' John Matheson, Ivor Tossell, author of the forthcoming The Gift of Ford, an ebook, and urban affairs journalist John Lawrence. Thank you all.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.